Conscious experience is a mechanical event of structural alignment. To understand how the mind fails, we first observe what it looks like when it works. A healthy brain constantly generates predictive models, internal blueprints guessing what will happen next. When those predictions successfully align with incoming sensory data and your internal physical state, the brain achieves recursive self-evidence. The system's expectations match reality. When this alignment is sustained efficiently, the system encounters its own coherent organization. The subjective experience of that structural efficiency, the feeling of the brain smoothly processing the world and itself, registers as deep happiness. Depression is the state in which that recursive architecture violently implodes. Understanding this requires analyzing it as a catastrophic failure of the brain's predictive processing. The neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky has spent decades mapping the stress physiology of depression. His biological data maps point for point onto the structural failure modes of the coherence framework. Sapolsky identifies anhedonia, the absolute inability to feel pleasure, as the core of the disease. Sadness is a coherent, organized response to a loss. Anhedonia is the system going completely dark. The framework explains why this happens. The sensory input of a beautiful sunset still arrives. The optic nerves process it. However, the recursive architecture can no longer organize a coherent response to that input. The emptiness described by patients reflects the structural inability of the brain to encounter its own coherent organization. The medium of consciousness has gone opaque to itself. This structural failure creates the exhaustion paradox. From the outside, a severely depressed person appears lethargic or perfectly immobile. Inside, their stress hormones are elevated, and their metabolic rate is in overdrive. In a healthy mind, when predictive models match reality, the system settles into a stable configuration, requiring almost zero wasted energy. In a depressed system, expectations fail to match incoming data. Error signals flood the brain. The compromised architecture attempts to reorganize, but fails. This initiates an infinite loop of failed prediction and chaotic reorganization. This loop consumes massive amounts of metabolic fuel, specifically cortisol and norepinephrine. The brain is locked in a state of constant, resource-intensive biological warfare. The profound physical fatigue seen in patients represents the immense metabolic cost of a system burning maximum fuel on failed attempts at coherence. This collapse propagates across the brain's major regulatory axes simultaneously. Tracked on a 3-axis chart, first, the dopaminergic system fails, causing motivational fragmentation. Next, the serotonergic system collapses, dissolving emotional differentiation into a single, featureless flatness. Finally, the noradrenergic system fails. Intention uncouples from the body, making physical movement feel like an alien trap. A high-functioning anxious person might experience a local failure but maintain global coherence. In severe depression, the capacity to form an intention, feel a distinct emotion, and initiate movement all break at once. No subsystem remains intact. The prefrontal cortex is the human engine for abstract future planning. In depression, this engine facilitates its own destruction. The depressed prefrontal cortex generates abstract models of the future that are uniformly catastrophic and selectively retrieves memories of pure helplessness. In this biological trap, lower regions like the amygdala cannot distinguish between an abstract thought of meaninglessness and a literal predator. The amygdala reacts by flooding the body with cortisol, preparing organs for a physical threat that exists only as a recursive prediction. The system has organized itself into a terribly stable, self-consistent configuration built entirely around hopelessness. Evolutionary hardware that allows for rich identity is hijacked to trap the body in a permanent state of biological terror. Acute stress can prompt focus and growth, but chronic stress actively destroys the biological infrastructure of recursion. Sustained high concentrations of cortisol are neurotoxic to brain tissue. This toxicity directly damages the hippocampus, eroding the system's capacity to connect past and future. It also damages the prefrontal cortex, destroying executive coherence, the ability to organize competing thoughts into a unified goal. Simultaneously, the brain's threat detection threshold lowers as the amygdala strengthens, biasing the system toward constant panic. This establishes a vicious biological cycle. Structural degradation produces less coherence produces more stress, and more stress produces further structural degradation. Chronic stress functions as the physical mechanism that unbuilds the neural architecture required for consciousness. Sapolsky describes the kindling effect, where subsequent episodes require less and less external trauma to trigger. This topographical landscape shows how that happens. With each major episode, the neural pathways of the depressive configuration are strengthened. It etches a well-worn groove into the brain's recursive landscape, making it easier for the system to fall back into collapse. This vulnerability often begins with early childhood adversity. Recursive coherence must be actively built during development through successful prediction correction cycles. In environments of chronic neglect, a child's brain learns that its internal predictions constantly fail. The resulting architecture is built for fragmentation. This leads to Martin Seligman's concept of learned helplessness. The system accumulates evidence of failure until the recursive engine stops trying to align with reality. The brain becomes an expert at its own fragmentation, reaching a state of dead stillness where mental processing occurs without any self-evidence of being alive. Sapolsky argues that demanding a severely depressed person just pull themselves together is equivalent to demanding a diabetic willpower their way out of a coma. Pulling yourself together is an executive function that requires an intact recursive architecture to execute. This is the cruelest trap. The specific cognitive tool required to fix the incoherence is the exact faculty that the condition has physically destroyed. This triad diagram maps the spectrum of human experience. At the top, the resonant sphere of deep happiness. In the middle, the unstable shape of the highly functioning but anxious mind. At the bottom sits the collapsed, motionless point, representing anhedonia and structural implosion. Recovery cannot come from internal willpower. It requires patient, externally scaffolded biological and therapeutic support to rebuild the hardware, allowing the mind to gradually encounter the evidence of its own existence once again.